Yes, I absolutely do. I absolutely do think that the Gospel of Matthew was written prior to the letters of Paul. Um, and it doesn't matter that it's widely refuted by New Testament textual scholars, including Bart Ehrman himself. Because as I said many times before, I never agree with anybody in their totality, nor should I expect anybody to ever agree with me as well. But here's the problem that I have with these New Testament scholars as well as Bart Ehrman. I do think the letters of Paul were written relatively at the same time as the Matthew Gospel, but I believe Matthew was written prior to it, maybe only by a decade, maybe by 2 or 3 decades, but certainly after Matthew was actually written. But this is why New Testament scholars, as well as Bart Ehrman, may think, because I don't know their mind, may think that Paul was written prior to that. It is because there is the belief that Paul actually existed. And if you believe that Paul actually existed, then you have to say that the lifetime of Paul had to have been, and he had to have been an adult in and around 40, 50 CE. He had to be. And then lived his life for however long into the beginning of the second century. But he had to be alive during that time frame. He had to be a Pharisee during that time frame. And since he had to be alive during the time frame of the apostles, then Paul had to have written and had his conversion in and around 50 to 60 CE. And if he had that conversion during that time frame, then he must have written in and around that time frame as well. And we know that Matthew wasn't written until at least after 70, most likely around 80 or 90. So Paul, in their mind, had to be written before then because they believe Paul existed. Whereas I, on the other hand, do not believe Paul ever existed. I believe that the letters of Paul were written by some of your early church fathers, as well as those who were in the Roman government who perpetuated this creation of the new Judaism, which you call Christianity. Those people being Herod, those people being mainly Josephus and Philo of Alexander. And then later on, you have your other so called church fathers who could have written additional letters that many scholars understand were not written by the same author, the later epistles. So when you take away the premise that Paul never existed, because we have absolutely no proof of Paul's existence, and the story of Paul is eerily like someone else's story. You see, Paul is most likely based on a character in the Greek, the Bacchae, in the Greek play of the Bacchae by Euripides. And Paul is the character, Pentheus, who does not want to believe in Dionysus. And Dionysus wants to set up a spiritual kingdom over the city, while Pentheus wants to set up a city based on law and order, a culture based on law and order and following the law. Much the same way Paul was a Pharisee who wanted to follow the law, Jesus is Dionysus who wants to set up this spiritual kingdom, but Pentheus refuses and wars against him and persecutes those who worship Dionysus out in the woods and out in the forest, and views them as doing illicit things and getting drunk and all these sorts of things until uh, until Dionysus' reign over him becomes too strong, and then Pentheus dies in his own illicit desires. This is where the story splits. This is where Paul falls subject to Dionysus. Pentheus falls subject to Dionysus, but he dies. Paul falls subject to Jesus, but he converts over to following Jesus. And so that's where the stories diverge. But the basis of the Paul character is eerily similar to the Bacchae, which was written centuries prior. And those people who were in the Roman authority would have known about that story because it was a very popular theatrical story in the Roman Empire. So I don't accept that Paul ever existed, that elements of the Bacchae were used to create Paul, and then later Christian writers wrote other letters attributing him to Paul. Because if you think about it, some of the churches that Paul supposedly wrote to weren't even in existence at the time frame that you think that they were written. Also, there is actually no historical data that demonstrates that Paul had meetings with the emperor or any other high level official in the Roman government, or that he was ever chained and put on a ship and brought to Rome and all these other things. There's absolutely zero historical data. So your belief in Paul's existence is purely belief because it's in your Bible, but it's nowhere else. Not in Jewish history, as far as him being a member of the Sanhedrin or a Pharisee or anything or Sadducee. There's no mentioning of this Paul character. So therefore, it's purely belief. This is why I say Paul never existed. And when you take away the idea of Paul's existence, then Paul's letters were not written before Matthew's gospel, because Matthew's gospel was written either by Josephus or by Philo of Alexandria and created to be your gospels for making a new type of Judaism that would be submissive to the Roman Empire in an attempt to stop the Jewish revolts that were happening throughout the Roman Empire. And if you wonder why Philo was a writer, he was a Hellenistic Jew in Alexandria, Egypt. He was part of the Roman establishment. And the fact that Alexandria was a quarter Jewish, the largest Jewish community in the Roman Empire was actually in Alexandria. So they definitely needed to be shut down because a lot of money passed through Alexandria, which is why Philo was an incredibly rich and wealthy Hellenistic Jew. You have a great day. And remember always, you have to free yourself to be yourself because your greatness is non-negotiable. Good journey, good vibration.